China is one of the most powerful countries in the world, with a large economy, however ruled in a totalitarian state where political opposition is crushed. Since the fall of the USSR, Communist China has been seen as the next big rival to the United States. But did it have to be like this? What if China, instead of being communist, became democratic? Well, today, we will ask, what if the KMT won the Chinese Civil War? For hundreds of years, China was one of the world's predominant powers, ruled by a series of dynasties. But the 20th century saw China experience many changes. The Qing dynasty had been forced to submit to the will of foreigners for several years. This era, also known as the Century of Humiliation, caused the Qing dynasty to be overthrown during the Xinhai Revolution. Chinese revolutionaries would then establish the Republic of China in 1912. But as it turns out, destroying the centuries-old imperial system caused China to fragment apart. A revolutionary named Sun Yat-sen became the first president of the new Chinese Republic, despite the fact he wasn't involved in the revolution. He was actually in Denver, Colorado at the time. Despite this, Sun Yat-sen promoted the three principles of the people and various other reforms, but many Chinese civilians stayed loyal to their own region or other leaders. Sun Yat-sen struck a deal with a Qing general named Yuan Shikai, where if Shikai could get the Chinese emperor to peacefully abdicate, then Shikai would become the new Chinese president. This proved to be easy because the Chinese Emperor Puyi was only 6 years old at the time, so Shikai became the new president, and his rule saw much celebration over the end of the imperial system. But Shikai didn't really like that, so he decided to become emperor in 1915. Obviously, this new imperial restoration was universally hated, and Shikai would resign and die a year later. Since China lacked a legitimate ruler, various warlords would take control of their own regions, and the warlord era would define Chinese history for over a decade. Sun Yat-sen would found his own political party to reunify China, called the Kuomintang, or the Chinese Nationalist Party, but the Kuomintang lacked major allies, so Sun Yat-sen set up relations with the Chinese Communist Party and the Soviet Union, and the First United Front. When Sun Yat-sen died in 1925, he was succeeded by General Chiang Kai-shek, who after defeating the last warlords, decided to turn on the communists, igniting the Chinese Civil War. In 1934, the nationalists had inflicted several defeats on the communists and came close to annihilating them, until the communists embarked on the famous Long March through the Chinese countryside. While they escaped defeat, the communists lost almost 90% of their armed forces. Following this, the CCP recognized Mao Zedong as their new leader. In 1937, the Japanese would launch a full-scale invasion of China with the hope of conquering the entire country. While Chiang Kai-shek originally fought both the communists and the Japanese, he was kidnapped in 1936 and agreed to an alliance with the communists. The Second United Front fought a series of campaigns against the Japanese. However, the nationalists made several notable mistakes during the war, such as abandoning their own capital, allowing the Japanese to massacre civilians, and flooding their own territory, causing hundreds of thousands of deaths. In 1945, the Pacific War ended with the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Any sense of unity ended quickly when the nationalists and communists returned to combat almost immediately, and most Chinese civilians decided to side with the communists. The Soviets supported the CCP and allowed them to pull off a shocking comeback and force the nationalists to the island of Taiwan. Meanwhile, Mao Zedong would become the new leader of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Throughout the 50s, both sides were still at odds, with America promising to defend Taiwan from any communist attack. The CCP attempted to industrialize China and bring support to their cause through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Leap Forward. Both of these attempts would fail and result in famines and deaths on a mass scale. Meanwhile, Taiwan would also go through several decades of martial law and political purges, known as the White Terror. When Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek died, both China and Taiwan took some steps away from authoritarianism. The debate on Taiwan's future continues between the Kuomintang and the opposing Democratic Progressive Party, who have been the incumbent leaders of Taiwan since 2016. Mainland China rebranded itself from absolute communism to socialism with Chinese characteristics, thus bringing some capitalist elements into the economy. But still, in the modern day, Taiwan is a contested hotspot in the ongoing geopolitical conflict between China and America. What if that changed? What if China didn't go communist, but instead nationalist? Well, our first change will be in 1934, with the Long March. The communists won their siege from the nationalists in a difficult position facing defeat. In our timeline, the communist leadership was split over their final decision, but in the end, the scattered escape was their best chance of survival. In this alternate timeline, let's say the Long March doesn't happen. Maybe the communist operations are delayed long enough to prevent escape. General Chiang Kai-shek is able to regroup his army of almost 300,000 for the final death blow to the communists. Several artillery strikes help prepare for the final nationalist assault on the city of Region. Mass human wave attacks by the Nationalist Revolutionary Army overwhelm communist defenses. A large battle on the city streets occurs, but in the end, the nationalists come out on top. Prominent communist leaders are captured and killed, including Zhou Enlai, Zhu Du, and Mao Zedong. The region is burned down in retaliation, with many civilians massacred for suspected communist sympathies. With the death of many Chinese communists, the power vacuum is filled by Wang Ming, who leaves Moscow, evacuates several CCP leaders, and establishes a government in exile in Vladivostok. With the early defeat of the communists, Chiang Kai-shek is able to stop any remaining warlords and secure his power over China. He and other leaders plan to use the next few years to modernize China, with promises made to civilians of future land reform and economic opportunities. But before any effective reform, the Japanese still launched their invasion of China in 1937. This is where our second change comes. We need to improve the nationalists' performance against the Japanese. For example, we can have the nationalists inflict more defeats on the Japanese at the Battle of Shanghai. This could happen for better equipment and possibly some more tanks. Regardless, this can delay the battle for at least another month, possibly longer into 1938. Also, we can have the nationalists expend resources towards evacuating much of the civilian populace after the battle, so the Nanking Massacre never happens on the scale we saw in our timeline. From this victory, another change we can add is with Chinese politician Wang Jingwei. In our timeline, he was a left-wing politician in the Kuomintang who eventually switched sides and joined the Japanese. In this alternate timeline, we need Wang Jingwei to stay loyal to the Kuomintang. Due to their political beliefs, Chiang Kai-shek and Wang Jingwei disliked each other, but with some slight changes, let's say they both make amends, Wang Jingwei and other left-wing politicians begin to pressure Chiang Kai-shek to help save Chinese civilians, so Chiang Kai-shek makes Wang Jingwei the head of civilian affairs, and the Nationalist Army begins to make wartime civilian rescue a priority. Under these changes, the army provides assistance to Chinese peasants, and Chiang Kai-shek never floods the Yellow River, which ends up saving several thousand lives. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese still launched an attack on Pearl Harbor, and this dragged the U.S. into the war on the Allied side. The Nationalists at this point have taken up the mantle of fighting in China, and with President Roosevelt's approval, I can imagine the U.S. may extend economic benefits and the Lend-Lease system to Nationalist China by 1942. With millions of dollars of aid and effective supplies, the Nationalists would ensure further victories throughout the Pacific War. Without a communist insurgency and a clear front against the Japanese, the Nationalists can inflict further defeats onto them. By 1945, the Japanese were defeated with the Nationalists in control of much of China. The Soviets occupying Manchuria while Chinese communists rise up in the center of the country try to push up for a national unity government between the communists and nationalists. However, the fiercely anti-communist Chiang Kai-shek refuses and launches a series of offensives into Manchuria. President Truman gives aid and advisors to the nationalists, as in our timeline, he was criticized for not doing these things. By 1947, the nationalists captured Harbin and reclaimed all of Manchuria. Wang Ming would call on Stalin to declare war on China, but he would refuse, fearing an American counterattack or a nuclear strike. Following the defeat of the communists, the KMT turned its attention to East Turkestan. The region had been in open revolt since 1944, and the nationalists would prioritize the reconquest of communist-held lands. The nationalist army uses their better-equipped forces to invade. However, facing communist resistance, Stalin would protest China's actions in the UN, thus eventually forcing a retreat. The Second East Turkestan Republic becomes a Soviet puppet state, independent from China. Meanwhile, the nationalists installed Masoud Sabri, a Uyghur Muslim politician, as the governor of a separate autonomous Turkestan province in nationalist China. Despite British attempts to enforce their independence, the nationalists launched an offensive, ending swiftly with the reintegration of Tibet as part of China. However, the nationalists allowed Tibetans to practice their religion freely, with the Dalai Lama given some executive powers over Tibet's governors. This is in contrast to how the Chinese communists exiled the Dalai Lama and continued to suppress calls for Tibetan independence. The late 1940s would be a very tense era, as the border between the USSR and nationalist China would remain very militarized. In 1950, the first major conflict of the Cold War began when North Korea invaded South Korea. The first changes happened in July of 1950. By this point, the North Koreans had captured Seoul and are pushing from Suwon into the South Korean countryside. The UN had already condemned the North Korean invasion and now begins to vote on intervening in the conflict. In our timeline, this resolution, UN Security Council Resolution Number 84, was put through and allowed a united military command to form in South Korea. But in this alternate timeline, the Soviets, who aren't boycotting the UN, veto this resolution to prevent formal intervention. The US and UK respond by sending volunteer units into South Korea, however without the large amount of support they got from the UN in our timeline. This string of victories would encourage intervention from nationalist China to the north. In September 1950, the Chinese crossed the Yalu River to support the South Korean war effort. By 1951, the Korean Civil War, as it is called, ended in the capture of Pyongyang. The remaining communist troops remained in active resistance. South Korea takes over the rest of the north, while China annexes a small portion of the north to ensure the Soviets don't share a border with Korea. After this, China would finally begin its reconstruction process. The country had been decimated from World War II and would finally halt any war plans for several years. President Chiang launches a campaign of mass suppression and opposition to any communist sympathy. Thousands of suspected communists are imprisoned in work camps or killed. This event, known as the White Terror, would define post-war China for years. This is accompanied by a series of industrial projects thanks to investments and loans from the US and other nations, alongside capitalist reforms to give the Chinese a more free market economy. These efforts were limited to aid and trade. Nationalist China gives these reconstruction and industrialization efforts to new industrial magnates, which help civilians find jobs. These new developments begin to escalate as the working class is mobilized to accomplish the government's goals. But this doesn't mean life in China would be perfect, as Chiang was known for not respecting human rights. The KMT would continue to push that authoritarian rule is necessary to prepare China for democracy, but in the coming years, people would begin to doubt that. Peasants and workers are commonly mistreated and worked to death, and any attempts at protests or unions are violently suppressed. With continued amounts of corruption and the need for land reform, much of the 1950s would be spent reforming China's government and its institutions. Our timelines of the communists killed several thousand landlords, while Taiwan gave away nearly a fifth of its public land to tenant farmers. So in mainland China, this reform would occur on a wider, more effective scale, removing much support for communism amongst the working class. In 1953, Stalin died and was replaced by Nikita Khrushchev. From here, Khrushchev attempts to settle down relations with China by extraditing remaining CCP members to China, where they would be brought to trial in Shanghai and either imprisoned or executed. This is seen in China as a great victory over communism. While this event would shock hardliners across the communist world, China would still have disputes with the USSR, and relations wouldn't get better since Kuomintang members believed that Mongolia and Turkestan should be rightful parts of China. For foreign policy, China would try to build up friendly relations with Korea and Japan, while operating as a member of the non-alignment movement around the 1960s and the ongoing Cold War. India is seen as a rival of China, and both countries actually fought a brief war in 1962, which is ultimately why the Kashmir border disputes exist. So would this war happen in this alternate timeline? Well, one of the main reasons India and China went to war was because of the communist China's treatment of Tibet. They brutally crushed the Tibetan uprising of 1959, and the Dalai Lama went into exile in India. But since nationalist China wouldn't be as repressive on Tibet, then this war would probably never happen, or be delayed for several years. China would be seen as a better U.S. ally, pushing India closer to the Soviet Union, though probably not going communist. To counter this, China and the U.S. would set up better relations with Pakistan and Burma. In the 1960s, China would be able to act more independently, and by this time, they probably forced the UK and Portugal to hand over Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong serves as an important financial hub for China, and the Chinese economy is growing rapidly. They also probably invest into more nuclear energy, possibly gaining nuclear weapons by the mid-1960s. In our timeline, Mao was generally skeptical of nuclear weapons, but Chiang Kai-shek could develop these weapons for defense from the USSR. The relation between these two would be closer to the relationship between the US and France today. Communism in this timeline is greatly weakened, with Maoism never existing and the communist world under Soviet hegemony. Since China and Korea never fell to communism, and the domino theory never existed in this timeline, and there is much less incentive for the United States to get involved in the Vietnam War, the U.S. probably limits involvement to advisors and supplies in order to keep the corrupt South Vietnam afloat. In the face of North Vietnamese victory, China helped South Vietnam as well. By the end of the decade, with the threat of escalation, the U.S. likely enforces a ceasefire, keeping the two Vietnams divided for the remainder of the Cold War. China also hosts the 1964 Summer Olympics in Nanking. By now, much more pressure for reform would exist, and the younger population would want to transition China into a democratic country. The nationalist government would resist these calls, and a series of brutal crackdowns on reformist groups would occur. In 1975, Chiang Kai-shek still died, and his vice president Yen Shih-kan briefly took control, and Chiang Kai-shek's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, would become the next president and start a series of new reforms to the Chinese government. The policing actions against reformers would slow down, and peaceful political rallies would be permitted. Criticism of the government would be allowed, however opposition parties would still be banned. These initial changes would cause further demand by protesters for reform to the corrupt KMT. In our timeline, Chiang Ching-kuo authorized a series of construction projects to help modernize Taiwan. In this timeline, something like this would occur in mainland China, except much larger. Key utilities would be expanded and unemployment would drop. This also leads to the expansion of workers' rights and the ability for unionization. The wages of average Chinese civilians would go up, and Chiang Ching-kuo's popularity at home and abroad would be very high. As the late 80s continued, the people would begin to call for free and fair elections. The ruling Kuomintang rejects this, but President Chiang Ching-kuo attempts to support these policies. In 1986, Chiang Ching-kuo passed a law allowing opposition parties to run in the next election. The next year, he dies, and a far-right Kuomintang junta attempts a coup supported by the Chinese elite to undo previous reforms. However, this sparks unrest and eventually chaos across nationalist China. Tibet proclaims independence, Inner Mongolians rise up to join Mongolia, and Turkestan reunites. This chaos was brought to an end by a new government of left-wingers and moderates in 1988, who re-established the Republic of China. Despite the end of the Cold War, this alternate China is much more liberal and democratic than our timeline. They rise to economic prominence and overtake Japan as the foremost Asian power, even coming close to overtaking the US in the 1990s. Chinese culture and media become more popular. In 1999, China founded the Asian Defense and Cooperation League, which started to overtake CETO. By the modern day, China is a nuclear-armed rival against India and Russia, while also a friendly competitor to the US, with influence across much of Asia. With its massive economic might and growing alliances, China may become the world's next big superpower, launching their own interventions into Thailand, Vietnam, and Burma to ensure their leadership remains friendly. Specifics get hard to predict from here, but it's also very likely the coronavirus pandemic never occurs. When a minor outbreak of COVID-19 occurs in Wuhan, the government intervenes and quarantines the city. Social distancing is put in place, along with medical attention to those who are infected. However, in February 2020, the crisis ends with the virus largely being eliminated. So the future from here is hard to tell. Will China rise to be the most powerful nation on Earth? Will war break out with India, Russia, or even America? Comment what you think will happen down below, and what other video ideas you want to see. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.